I never told my son about my $75,000 a month salary. He always thought I was just a cashier. His wife called me a broke beggar at a family dinner and threw out my gift. A month later, I bought the house of their dreams right across the street. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I was 58 years old, and for 31 years I had worked the register at Hendrick's Family Market on Route 9 in Brookfield, Ohio. Every morning I tied on the same green apron, counted my drawer, and said good morning to the same regulars who had watched my hair go from brown to gray. My son, Daniel, believed that was the whole of my life. A cashier's paycheck, a modest 2-bedroom house on Larkspur Street, a 15-year-old Honda in the driveway. He had no idea that the laundromat his father and I bought in 1994 for $11,000 had, over 3 decades, become 4 laundromats, 2 strip malls, and a portfolio of rental properties managed quietly through a holding company called Brookfield Crest, LLC. He had no idea that after his father, Robert, died of a heart attack 6 years ago, I had kept every promise we made to each other, to live simply, to never let money change who we were, and to make sure Daniel grew up understanding the value of work rather than the comfort of an inheritance. By the time my accountant, Frank Dorsey, filed my taxes that spring, my combined income from rent, dividends, and the laundromat chain came to just over $75,000 a month. Daniel still thought I clipped coupons because I had to. Daniel had married Vanessa 3 years earlier. She came from a family in Cleveland that measured worth in zip codes and car brands, and from the very first dinner she ever had at my table, I felt her eyes move over my secondhand dishware the way an appraiser looks at something she has already decided is worthless. She was polite in the way people are polite to a waiter they don't intend to tip well. She called me Mrs. Carter instead of Mom, and she always managed to mention, within the first 10 minutes of any visit, something about her own mother's lake house or her father's law firm, or the renovation she and Daniel were planning for their colonial on Aspen Lane, the kind of house, she liked to say, that people like us deserve. I told myself it didn't matter. I had buried a husband. I had raised a good son on my own for the last 6 years, even if Daniel didn't fully understand how much of that on my own had actually meant. I had nothing to prove to a 31-year-old woman who thought a cashier's apron was the whole of a person's story. But the small cuts add up. Vanessa would ask in front of her friends whether I needed help paying for Lucas and Emma's birthday gifts. She would mention my Honda's check engine light as though it were a diagnosis of my entire life. Once at a 4th of July barbecue, she'd laughed. Not unkindly, she would have said, just lightly, when I mentioned I was saving up for a new water heater, and said, "Oh, Linda, you should really let Daniel help you. We can't have you living like that forever." Living like that. As if 31 years of waking at 5 in the morning to open a grocery store register was a sentence I was serving instead of a choice I had made. The night everything changed was Vanessa's 31st birthday dinner, held at their house in October. I had spent 2 weeks on her gift. Not money, because money was never the point with Vanessa, but a quilt I had made from squares of Robert's old flannel shirts, stitched by hand the way my own mother had taught me, meant for the nursery they were planning for their third child. I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with string, and I carried it into that house with more hope than I'd felt in months. Hope that maybe, finally, some small gesture would bridge the distance between us. Vanessa opened it in front of her sister, her mother, and 2 friends from her office. I watched her face change from polite anticipation to something closer to embarrassment. She held the quilt up by 2 fingers, the way you'd hold something that had been found in a gutter, and she let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh my God," she said, glancing at her sister. "Is this from, like, old shirts?" She turned to me, and her voice dropped into the tone people use when they've decided they no longer need to be careful. "Linda, I love that you tried. I really do. But this isn't really our style. We're trying to do the nursery in a very specific palette." She set it down on the side table, then, almost as an afterthought, picked it back up and dropped it into the kitchen trash can on her way to refill her wine. "Honestly," she said to her sister, not quite quietly enough, "I don't know why Daniel didn't marry someone with a little more, I don't want to say the word, but you know, we can't keep explaining the niche Brodka thing to people." Broke trash. That was the word she didn't want to say, and said anyway. I stood there in my daughter-in-law's kitchen, 58 years old with $75,000 a month, sitting quietly in accounts she would never see, and I felt something inside me go very still and very cold. Daniel hadn't heard it. He was out on the porch with his father-in-law talking about football. No one defended me. No one needed to, I told myself, walking out to my car alone that night. I would defend myself, and I already knew, with a clarity that surprised even me, exactly how I was going to do it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea going cold in front of me, replaying the sound of that quilt hitting the bottom of the trash can, and I made myself do something I rarely did. I counted the cost. What had I actually lost? Not money. I had plenty of that, more than Vanessa could have imagined in her wildest fantasies about people like us. What I had lost was 31 years of quietly absorbing small humiliations, because I believed that staying small kept the peace, kept Daniel comfortable, kept Robert's memory of a simple, honest life intact. I had told myself that hiding my wealth was a virtue. Sitting there at 1 a.m, I started to wonder whether it had become a kind of cowardice instead. Whether I had let a woman half my age treat me like garbage because I'd built my entire identity around not being seen. There was fear in it too, and I won't pretend otherwise. Fear that if I revealed everything at once, Daniel would feel betrayed, that he would side with his wife out of loyalty or exhaustion, that I would end up estranged from my grandchildren, Emma and Lucas, the 2 people in this world who still ran to hug my legs every time I walked through their door. Vanessa had power over me precisely because of that fear. She could control access to those children. Money couldn't undo 6 years of careful relationship building if I handled this badly. So I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted something else. I wanted the truth to exist in that family, finally, on my terms and in my timing, not leaking out through someone else's gossip or a moment of carelessness. And if the truth, once it arrived, happened to also teach Vanessa a lesson about the dangers of contempt. Well, I wasn't going to apologize for that. The next morning, I drove to Frank Dorsey's office instead of opening my register at Hendricks. I called in sick for the first time in 4 years. Frank had managed my late husband's business affairs since before Robert died, and he was the only person besides my lawyer who knew the real shape of my finances. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, waving me into his cramped office full of filing cabinets. "I didn't," I said, and I told him what had happened. The quilt in the trash, the words she'd used, the years of small comments before it. Frank, who had known me long enough to recognize when I was past the point of being talked out of something, simply nodded and asked, "What do you want to do?" I told him about the house on Aspen Lane, 2 doors down from Daniel and Vanessa's place. A white colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch that Vanessa had pointed out to me on no fewer than 4 separate occasions, always with the same wistful sigh. That's the kind of house we're going to have one day, once Daniel gets that promotion. It had been for sale for 3 months, listed at $640,000, sitting empty because the owners had already relocated for a job in Chicago. "I want to buy it," I said, "through Brookfield Crest, quietly, no one's name on it but the LLC's. Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He had watched me build that company from a laundromat with a broken dryer into something substantial, and he knew better than most that I didn't make impulsive decisions. "And then what?" he asked. "You just live there? Across the street from them?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I know I'm done being invisible in my own family. I'm done being the punchline at birthday parties." I paused, and something in my chest tightened. "I also want to talk to Gregory about my will." Gregory Hale had drafted my estate documents years ago, back when Daniel was newly married and everything still felt hopeful. At the time, I had left the bulk of my estate to Daniel outright, trusting that he and Vanessa would manage it responsibly. Sitting in Frank's office, I realized I no longer trusted that assumption, not fully. Not because I doubted Daniel's heart, but because I had begun to wonder how much of Daniel's heart Vanessa had quietly redirected over 3 years of marriage. That afternoon, I called Gregory's office and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Then I called Diane Pierce, the realtor who'd had the Aspen Lane listing in the local paper for weeks, and asked her to meet me, not at her office, but at a coffee shop 2 towns over where no one from Brookfield would recognize me. Driving home that evening, I passed Daniel and Vanessa's house. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see Vanessa laughing at something, her wine glass raised, utterly unaware that 1 street over, the woman she'd called broke trash in front of her own sister was about to become her neighbor. I didn't feel triumphant yet. Mostly I felt tired and a little frightened of what I was setting into motion. But underneath that fear was something steadier. A plan, finally, after 31 years of biting my tongue. Diane Pierce met me at the coffee shop in Millbrook with a folder of paperwork and the particular caution of a realtor who has learned not to ask too many questions about a buyer's reasons. I told her only what she needed to know. Brookfield Crest, LLC, was interested in the Aspen Lane property as a long-term investment. The offer would be at full asking price with a 30-day close, and my name was not to appear on any document she filed with the county. She didn't blink. In her line of work, anonymous LLC purchases happened more often than people realized. We signed the offer that Thursday. I transferred the funds from an account Vanessa didn't know existed, using a routing number tied to a bank 40 minutes outside Brookfield, and within a week the sellers in Chicago had accepted. Diane warned me it would take roughly 3 to 4 weeks to close, longer if the inspection turned up anything unusual. I told her I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't in a hurry about anything. I was simply moving deliberately towards something I had decided to do. The following Tuesday, I sat across from Gregory Hale in his office on Court Street, a room I hadn't visited in almost 5 years, since the last time I'd updated my will after Robert's death. Gregory was a careful man, the kind who read documents twice before he let a client sign them, and when I told him I wanted to restructure my estate plan, to place a significant portion of my assets into a trust for my grandchildren, Emma and Lucas, with provisions that would shield those funds from being controlled or liquidated by anyone outside a narrow list of trustees. He asked the obvious question, does this have to do with Daniel or with Vanessa? I thought about how to answer honestly without sounding bitter. It has to do with making sure that whatever I've built outlives any one person's opinion of me, I said. Daniel is still my son. He'll still be provided for. But I want to be smarter about how, and I want Emma and Lucas protected no matter what happens in that marriage. Gregory nodded slowly and began drafting the language for a generation-skipping trust, with Frank Dorsey and a corporate trustee named as co-administrators, myself retaining the right to amend it while I was alive. It would take a few weeks to finalize, he said. I told him that was fine. Everything, it seemed, was moving on the same slow, deliberate timeline. The house, the trust, the truth I was preparing to finally let loose. It was during that same week that I began to suspect Vanessa had noticed something was different. I had stopped accepting her last-minute invitations to casual dinners, the kind where she liked to needle me in front of an audience, and I had started declining her offers to help me with things, refinancing my house, switching my car insurance, organizing my finances now that I was getting older. Normally, I let those comments pass. Now I simply said no, thank you, I've got it handled, and changed the subject. Vanessa, who was used to a quiet, agreeable mother-in-law, did not take well to the shift. She called Daniel about it. I know this because Daniel called me himself, sounding confused rather than accusatory. Mom, is everything okay? Vanessa said you seemed kind of different lately, distant. I'm fine, sweetheart, I told him. I've just been thinking about some things. Getting older has a way of doing that. He let it go, because that's who Daniel was. A man who avoided conflict the way some people avoid spicy food, out of long habit rather than principle. But 2 days later, I learned something that turned my plan from a quiet correction into something with far more weight. I had stopped by Daniel and Vanessa's house to drop off a casserole, old habits, and I overheard through the partially open door of the home office Vanessa on the phone with her mother. I told Daniel we should talk to her about a power of attorney, she was saying, her voice pitched low but not low enough. I mean, she's getting older, and honestly, with no real savings in that ancient car, somebody needs to start managing things before she ends up a burden on us. I already mentioned it to Daniel. He's resistant, but I think if we frame it as protecting her, he'll come around. I stood very still in that hallway, casserole dish growing heavy in my hands. They were not just mocking me. They were planning quietly to gain legal control over a woman they believed had nothing. And once they discovered she had everything, that same legal authority would have given Vanessa access to a fortune she had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist while privately scheming to control it. That was the moment the plan stopped being about a thrown-away quilt. That was the point of no return. I set the casserole down on their kitchen counter without announcing myself, walked back out to my car, and sat in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. A power of attorney. They wanted legal authority over a woman they believed had nothing to manage, which told me everything I needed to know about what they intended to do once they discovered she had quite a lot. It wasn't concern for my well-being. It was a door they wanted open before they understood what was behind it. The closing on Aspen Lane finalized 11 days later. I drove past the house that afternoon, empty, waiting, the realtor's lockbox still hanging from the front door handle, and felt the strange, quiet satisfaction of having done something irreversible. I hired a small local crew, paid in cash through Brookfield Crest, to handle a modest refresh. New paint on the porch railing, the kitchen counters replaced. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw the attention of a neighborhood not yet aware of who their new resident would be. I told the crew, and later the moving company, that the owner preferred to remain private until move-in. No one questioned it. People rarely ask too many questions when the check's clear. It was the moving truck that gave it away. 3 weeks after closing on a gray Saturday morning, I watched from my car parked a block over as Vanessa walked out onto her porch, in her robe, coffee in hand, and stopped cold at the sight of a moving truck idling in front of the white Colonial 2 doors down. The house she had pointed at with such longing for over a year. I watched her walk closer, watched her read the names stenciled on the side of the moving company's truck, watched her pull out her phone. She called Daniel first. I learned this later because Daniel called me almost immediately, his voice tight with confusion. "Mom, did you know somebody bought the Aspen house? Vanessa's freaking out. She said she saw movers." I told him I had no idea, which was, strictly speaking, a lie I allowed myself for one more day, because I wanted to see the truth land on my own terms, in my own house, not shouted across a driveway. That terms arrived faster than I expected. By Monday evening, Vanessa had somehow tracked the LLC's paperwork. She had a friend in real estate, it turned out, who'd pulled the county filing and recognized Diane Pierce's name as the listing agent. Diane, to her credit, hadn't revealed anything, but Vanessa was clever enough and angry enough to put pieces together herself. She showed up at my house that evening without calling first, Daniel trailing behind her looking like a man walking into a storm he didn't fully understand. "Did you buy that house?" Vanessa demanded the moment I opened the door, not even a greeting first. "Brookfield Crest. That's you, isn't it? Linda, what is going on? Where would you even get that kind of money?" I let them both into my living room, the same modest living room Vanessa had spent 3 years quietly pitying, and I told her the truth, simply and without apology. The laundromats, the properties. The 31 years of working a register not out of necessity but out of choice, because Robert and I had agreed that money should never change how we treated people. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, then something sharper. Not embarrassment, as I might have hoped, but calculation. "So you've had money this whole time," she said, her voice climbing, "and you let us think, you let Daniel think, that we needed to take care of you. Do you have any idea how that looks? You've been lying to your own son." "I haven't lied to anyone," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I simply didn't share information with people who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting without it. And I overheard you on the phone with your mother, Vanessa, talking about getting power of attorney over me. So forgive me for not feeling particularly inclined to hand you a financial disclosure form." Vanessa's face went white, then red. She accused me of spying, of manipulating Daniel, of playing games with the family. Daniel, caught between us, asked his wife to calm down, which only made her angrier. She left that night threatening, in a voice shaking with fury, that I would regret keeping secrets from this family, and that she would make sure Daniel saw exactly what kind of person I really was. I didn't argue further. I simply told them both good night and closed my door. For 3 days afterward, I didn't answer Vanessa's calls or texts. I drove out to the cemetery and sat by Robert's headstone for the better part of an hour, telling him, the way I sometimes still did, about everything that had happened. Then I spent a quiet weekend with the curtains drawn, drinking too much tea, letting my nerves settle before whatever came next. By the following week, Vanessa's approach had shifted. The fury of that first confrontation gave way to something quieter, and in its way, more dangerous, an attempt to charm rather than intimidate. She called and left a voicemail in a soft, almost apologetic tone, asking if I'd like to come over for lunch. Just the two of us, no pressure. I think we got off on the wrong foot. I recognized the strategy immediately because I had watched Vanessa work a room for 3 years. When force didn't move me, she would try warmth instead. Manufactured, but warmth all the same. I went, mostly because I was curious what she wanted, and partly because I didn't want Daniel caught in the middle of 2 women refusing to speak to each other. She'd made a salad, poured sparkling water, and spent the first 10 minutes complimenting my incredible business sense in a voice so saccharine it nearly curdled the lettuce. Then, almost casually, she got to the point. "Daniel and I have been talking," she said, "about maybe consolidating things, financially. With everything you've built, it would make sense to set up a family trust, something Daniel could help manage. He's so good with numbers, so everything's protected and organized." She smiled. "I just want what's best for the family, Linda, for Emma and Lucas especially." I sat there, my untouched glass of sparkling water sweating onto the table, and I thought about how 3 weeks earlier this same woman had called me broke trash in front of her sister, and now she wanted help organizing $75,000 a month. I thought about the power of attorney conversation I'd overheard. I thought about how convenient it was that Emma and Lucas had only entered her concerns once my net worth had been revealed. "That's interesting," I said, keeping my voice level. "I've actually already set up a trust for Emma and Lucas, with Gregory Hale and Frank Dorsey as trustees. It's designed specifically so that no single person, including Daniel, including me, including you, can access or redirect those funds outside the terms I've set. I think that protects them best." Vanessa's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes went hard and still, like a door quietly shutting. Wow, that's very thorough of you, she said. I just think as a family, we should be making these decisions together. We are a family, I said. But trust is something that gets built over years, Vanessa, not assumed because the numbers changed. I thanked her for lunch, told her the salad was lovely, and left before the conversation could curdle into something neither of us could walk back from. She didn't call again that week or the next. I heard through Daniel in the careful, neutral way he'd started reporting things to me that Vanessa had been processing a lot and needed some space. I understood that to mean she was regrouping, watching, waiting for an angle I hadn't yet closed off. I didn't mind the silence. It gave me room to breathe, and it gave me time to do something I'd been needing to do for longer than I wanted to admit. Lean on the people who had never once needed an explanation of my finances to treat me with respect. I called Carol Jennings, my closest friend since we'd worked the same shift at Hendrix 20 years ago, before she retired to open a small flower shop on Main Street. I told her everything: the quilt, the trash can, the eavesdropped phone call, the house on Aspen Lane. Carol, who had known me through Robert's death and through every ordinary Tuesday in between, didn't gasp or scold or tell me I'd handled it wrong. She just listened, and when I finished, she said, "Linda, you've spent 30 years making yourself smaller so nobody would feel uncomfortable around you. I think it's about time somebody felt a little uncomfortable." We started having dinner together twice a week again, the way we used to before her shop took up so much of her time. I told my older brother Walt, who lived 2 states away, and he laughed so hard on the phone that I had to hold the receiver away from my ear, then told me he was proud of me, that our own mother would have done exactly the same thing in my position. Slowly, without my quite noticing it happening, I stopped feeling like a woman bracing for an attack and started feeling like a woman who had people standing behind her. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to be watching from a careful distance, the way a cat watches a door it isn't yet ready to walk through. I didn't know what she was planning next, but for the first time in weeks, I found I wasn't afraid to find out. The next move came on a Sunday afternoon in late November, 10 days before Thanksgiving. Daniel called first, asking if he and Vanessa could come by. "Just to talk, Mom. No arguing, I promise." I agreed, mostly because I missed my son, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped that beneath all of this, a real conversation was possible. I spent the hour before they arrived tidying a house that didn't need tidying, telling myself over and over that I would not be the one to raise my voice first, no matter what was said across that table. They arrived together, Vanessa carrying a small potted plant as a peace offering, her face arranged into an expression of careful, rehearsed humility. Daniel looked exhausted in a way that worried me more than anything Vanessa had said in weeks. The particular tiredness of a man trying to hold 2 people he loved on opposite sides of a widening gap. He hugged me a beat longer than usual at the door, and I felt in that hug how much weight he'd been carrying alone since Thanksgiving. "I owe you an apology," Vanessa began, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands folded like a woman in a confessional. "What I said at my birthday about the quilt, that was cruel, and I felt terrible about it. I think I was just overwhelmed with the pregnancy stress, and I took it out on you. I hope you can forgive me." It was, I had to admit, a better performance than the lunch invitation. She even managed something close to tears. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand, looking at me with quiet hope. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself wonder if it might be real. I poured her a glass of water she didn't ask for, an old habit of hospitality I couldn't quite switch off even now, and waited. But then she kept talking, and the mask, as it always eventually does, began to slip at the seams. I just think, she said, her voice gathering momentum, that if we're going to move past this, as a family, it would really help if you considered selling the Aspen house. I mean, it's a little strange, isn't it, you living right across from us? People are already asking questions. It would be so much easier if you just let Daniel and me buy it from you, at a fair price, obviously, and you could find something closer to your old neighborhood, somewhere more comfortable for you. There it was. Not an apology at all, but a negotiation wearing an apology's clothes. She wanted the house she had always wanted it handed over under the guise of reconciliation, and wanted me tucked safely back into Larkspur Street, where I wouldn't complicate the image she'd built of herself as a woman who'd married up, not a woman whose mother-in-law could buy and sell properties without blinking. Vanessa, I said carefully, I'm not selling that house. I bought it because I wanted to be close to my grandchildren, and because, frankly, I'd earned the right to live somewhere nice after 31 years behind a register. If that makes things uncomfortable for you, I'm sorry, but it's not something I'm willing to change. Her composure cracked all at once, the rehearsed softness evaporating into something rawer and angrier. You're doing this on purpose, she snapped. You're trying to humiliate me. Everyone in this neighborhood is going to know that Daniel's mother, the cashier, bought a $600,000 house just to rub it in my face. I bought it for myself, I said. Whatever you choose to make it mean about you is your own business. Daniel finally found his voice. Vanessa, that's enough. Mom didn't do this to hurt you. But his wife was already standing, gathering her purse, her face flushed with a fury she no longer bothered to disguise. For one strange second, I saw something almost like panic flicker beneath the anger. The look of a woman watching a plan come apart faster than she could improvise around it. You'll regret this, she said at the door, echoing almost exactly what she'd said weeks earlier. You think you've won something, Linda, but you have no idea what you've started. She walked out without the potted plant, leaving it on my table like an afterthought, and Daniel followed her with a backward glance that carried more apology in it than anything his wife had managed all afternoon. I watched them both walk down my front path, Vanessa already on her phone before they'd reached the car, and I wondered, not for the first time, who on the other end of that call was about to hear her version of the evening. After the door shut, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long while, my hands not quite steady around my teacup. I won't pretend her words didn't frighten me a little. There was something in her eyes, in that last threat, that felt less like wounded pride and more like a woman calculating her next move. But underneath the fear, something else was building too. Something I recognized from the months after Robert died, when I'd had to decide, alone, whether I was going to fold or keep going. I thought about the trust Gregory had finalized for Emma and Lucas. I thought about the power of attorney conversation Vanessa thought I'd never heard, I thought about 31 years of an apron and a register and a quiet life built, in part, to avoid exactly this kind of conflict, and I realized that avoiding it had never actually protected me. It had only delayed it. Whatever Vanessa was planning next, I intended to be ready for it. I picked up the abandoned plant, set it on the windowsill where the afternoon light reached it, and told myself that whatever came next, I had already survived worse than one angry woman's threats. Thanksgiving fell on a Thursday that year, and despite everything, Daniel asked if I would still come. He was hosting, as he had the last 2 years, and he said quietly, over the phone, that he wanted his children to see their grandmother at the table no matter what was happening between the adults. I agreed, though I suspected correctly as it turned out, that Vanessa had something planned of her own. I arrived at 4 with a pie, the same pumpkin pie I'd made every year since Daniel was a boy, and the house was already full. Vanessa's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, a handful of her college friends who'd become regular fixtures at their gatherings. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a brittle smile and ushered me toward the dining room with a politeness so exaggerated it felt like a warning. It came during dessert. Vanessa stood tapping her wine glass for attention, and I watched her face settle into the expression I now recognized as her performing voice, warm on the surface, calculated underneath. "Before we finish up," she said, "I just wanted to share something, because I think honesty is so important in families." She looked directly at me. "Linda has been keeping a pretty significant secret from all of us. Turns out she's been sitting on quite a bit of money this whole time. Bought a $600,000 house a couple streets over without telling anyone, while letting Daniel think she needed help making ends meet. I just think people should know what kind of person they're really dealing with." The table went quiet. Vanessa's mother looked scandalized in the theatrical way of someone enjoying scandal more than she let on. Daniel's face went pale, caught off guard by the public staging of something he and I had only discussed privately. I set down my fork and I felt something inside me settle into a kind of stillness I hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly, but a cold, clear certainty that the moment I had quietly prepared for had finally arrived. "Since we're sharing things tonight," I said, my voice carrying easily across the table, "let me add a little more honesty to the conversation." I looked at Vanessa, who blinked, clearly not expecting me to take the invitation she'd offered. 3 weeks before I bought that house, I overheard you on the phone with your mother discussing getting power of attorney over my finances. Before you knew I had any money worth controlling, you told her it would be easy to convince Daniel I needed managing because I seemed like such a burden. A small gasp rippled from somewhere near Vanessa's sister. And a few weeks before that, at your birthday, you took a quilt I made by hand from my late husband's shirts, called me a piece of broke trash in front of your sister, and threw it in your kitchen trash can. Vanessa's face drained of color. "That is not. I never said that," she stammered, her eyes darting toward her sister, who was suddenly very interested in her napkin. "Linda, you're twisting things. You're trying to make me look." "I have a recording of the power of attorney call," I said evenly, "on my phone's voicemail, actually, because you called Daniel right after and he butt-dialed me by accident while you were both still talking in the car. I never meant to keep it. I just never deleted it." This was, in fact, perfectly true. Daniel's pocket had pressed call on my number, and I'd let the message run rather than hang up, too stunned at the time to do anything but listen. Daniel turned to his wife, and I watched something shift in his face. Not the confused, conflict-averse expression he'd worn for weeks, but something harder, more decided. "Is that true?" he asked quietly. "You wanted to get power of attorney over my mother?" "Daniel, I was trying to protect this family." "From what?" His voice rose for the first time all evening. "From my mother having money you didn't know about. Vanessa, you tried to take legal control of her finances before you even knew there was money to take control of. What does that tell you about why you actually wanted it?" The table had gone fully silent now, Vanessa's mother no longer looking scandalized, but uncomfortable, her sister staring fixedly at the tablecloth. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, but for the first time since I'd known her, nothing polished or rehearsed came out. She looked, for just a moment, like a woman who had built an entire performance around an audience that had just stopped believing the script. The silence after Daniel's question stretched long enough that Vanessa's father finally cleared his throat and suggested, in the strained voice of a man trying to rescue a sinking dinner party, that perhaps everyone should take a breath. But the breath, when it came, didn't soften anything. It simply gave the room a moment to fully absorb what had just happened. Vanessa tried one more time to recover the narrative. "I think this is all a huge misunderstanding," she said, forcing a laugh that landed in the quiet room like a dropped plate. Linda clearly heard part of a conversation out of context, and now she's turned it into this whole... "I heard the whole thing, Vanessa," I said. "And so did everyone at this table just now when you stood up and announced my finances to a room full of people without my permission, in my son's home, on a holiday. I didn't start this conversation tonight. You did." Daniel stood from his chair, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a decision already made. "I think we need to talk," he said to Vanessa. "Alone, right now." He didn't wait for her to agree. He walked toward the hallway, and after a long, humiliated pause, Vanessa followed him, her face flushed with an anger that had nowhere left to go. I sat at the table with her stunned relatives for what felt like a very long 15 minutes, making small, careful conversation about the pie, about the weather, about anything that wasn't the conversation happening behind a closed bedroom door down the hall. Vanessa's mother, to her credit, eventually leaned over and said quietly, "I had no idea she said those things to you. I'm sorry, Linda. That's not how we raised her." I thanked her and meant it, recognizing that not every member of that family deserved to be painted with Vanessa's brush. When Daniel and Vanessa came back, his eyes were red-rimmed but resolved, and hers were swollen from crying in a way that no longer looked performed. "Vanessa's going to stay at her parents' for a while," Daniel announced to the room, his voice steady despite everything. "We have some things to work through. I think it's best if everyone heads home." There was no further drama, no shouting, no scene beyond what had already played out, just the slow, awkward exodus of relatives gathering coats and making excuses, the particular quiet of a family event that had ended several hours early and considerably more honest than it began. In the weeks that followed, the consequences settled the way consequences usually do, not all at once, but steadily, like sediment. Daniel and Vanessa separated, not immediately for divorce, but for what Daniel called real space to figure out who we actually are. He moved temporarily into the guest room of my new house on Aspen Lane, an arrangement that struck both of us, more than once, as a strange and fitting kind of justice. Daniel sleeping under the roof of the house his wife had once demanded I give up. Vanessa, for her part, discovered that contempt has a way of outliving its usefulness once the person it's aimed at stops absorbing it quietly. Word moved through Brookfield's small social circles the way word always does, not because I told anyone, but because Vanessa's own mother and sister, embarrassed by what they'd witnessed at that dinner table, weren't especially motivated to defend her. The women's group she'd led at her church quietly stopped inviting her to organize events. Her job in marketing, which had always relied partly on her polished social image, grew strained when colleagues who'd heard the story began treating her with a new wariness. 3 months later, Daniel filed for divorce. It was not a vindictive process. Gregory Hale, working alongside Daniel's own attorney, made sure the trust I'd established for Emma and Lucas remained entirely untouchable, exactly as designed, protected from anyone's reach but the children's own future. Vanessa fought for a larger settlement than the marriage's modest joint assets actually supported, lost most of those arguments in mediation, and ended up, in the end, with considerably less than she'd have had if she'd simply treated an old woman in a grocery store apron with basic human decency. I didn't celebrate her downfall, not exactly, but I won't pretend I didn't feel, watching it unfold from a respectful distance, something close to peace, the particular hard-earned peace of a woman who had finally stopped letting someone else decide what she was worth. Spring came, and with it, a version of my life I hadn't quite let myself imagine even while I was building it. I sold the little house on Larkspur Street, not out of necessity, but because it no longer made sense to keep 2 homes when Daniel and the children were 2 doors away on Aspen Lane, and because I'd realized, somewhere over that long winter, that hanging onto the old house had been its own kind of hiding. I gave my notice at Hendrick's Family Market the same week, not in anger, but with genuine gratitude for 31 years of regulars who'd never once needed to know my net worth to treat me like I mattered. They threw me a small retirement party in the break room, store-bought cake and a card signed by people who'd watched my hair go gray, and I cried more at that party than I had at any moment during the whole ordeal with Vanessa. Daniel and the children settled into a rhythm with me that felt, for the first time in years, uncomplicated. Emma, 6 now, had taken to riding her bike the short distance between our 2 driveways almost daily, and Lucas, 4, had developed the habit of showing up at my back door asking whether I had the good cookies, meaning the oatmeal ones I made from Robert's mother's recipe. Daniel, working through his divorce and the slower work of rebuilding himself afterward, leaned on me in a way he hadn't been able to in years, not financially, since the trust and my will had been carefully structured to support the children's future rather than bail out his present, but emotionally, the way a grown son sometimes needs to lean on his mother when a marriage falls apart around him. I started, with Frank's help, a modest scholarship fund through Brookfield Crest for employees of the businesses I owned, laundromat attendants, strip mall tenants' children, anyone working the kind of long, underappreciated hours I'd worked for 3 decades. It wasn't a large gesture in the scheme of my finances, but it mattered to me in a way that the houses and the properties never quite had. Carol helped me design the application forms at her kitchen table over wine, both of us laughing more than we had in years. Vanessa's life, by contrast, did not land softly. The divorce finalized in late spring, and without the income and lifestyle that being married to Daniel and being adjacent to a family she'd assumed had money to protect her, had quietly provided, she found herself renting a 1-bedroom apartment across town, far smaller than the colonial she'd once demanded I hand over. Her job at the marketing firm grew increasingly precarious. I heard, secondhand through Carol, who heard it through the flower shop's grapevine, that she'd been let go that summer after a string of accounts pulled their business. The official reason involving performance, the unofficial reason involving the particular brittleness people develop when their carefully built image starts cracking in public. Her relationship with Emma and Lucas, which she'd once wielded so casually as leverage, suffered too. Not because Daniel was vindictive in custody arrangements, he wasn't. The court settled on a standard shared schedule, but because children notice things adults assume go past them. Emma, in her quiet 6-year-old way, had started asking Daniel why Mommy used to say mean things about Grandma, and Daniel, to his credit, answered honestly rather than protecting Vanessa's image at his mother's expense. Children draw their own conclusions from honest answers in time. I ran into Vanessa once, that August, at the grocery store. Not Hendrick's, a different one across town, the kind of coincidence small towns occasionally produce. She looked thinner than I remembered, her cart holding the kind of careful, budget-conscious selections I recognized from my own younger years. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the produce aisle, 2 women who had once shared a dinner table and a depth of contempt I doubted either of us had fully understood at the time. "Linda?" she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Vanessa," I said, and nodded, and that was the whole of our conversation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply pushed my cart toward the checkout, paid for my groceries with the kind of unhurried ease that money provides, but character, in the end, actually earns, and drove home to a house with black shutters and a porch where my grandchildren would be waiting, asking whether I'd brought the good cookies.